Okay.
Adi, resume.
I can resume, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, welcome everyone. So, let's start with the topic of behavioral economics. Thank you for joining the webinar. Just to give you a quick intro, uh, behavioral economics is something which is like a recent, not a recent phenomenon, but it's been around for a while. But this is what happened after you had many years of classical economics, and when we found out that a lot of things in classical economics were not being explained, could not be explained, so then came this whole thing of behavioral economics, and today it's a full-fledged branch of economics, and you even have people who won the Nobel Prize for their work in behavioral economics. But before we can dive into behavioral economics, let's just talk a bit about classical economics and where classical economics kind of is not able to explain a lot of things. Now, so if you look at classical economics, the main thing in classical economics is rationality. That's like the big assumption that is there in classical economics. Now, classical economics assumes that all people who are there, they are rational people. They take rational decisions which maximize wealth. Even if you look at something like the law of demand, the graph that I show here, uh, the law of demand clearly states that if you are at a point E1 buying something at a price P1, you consume quantity Q1. So as soon as you drop the price from P1 to P2, you consume more of that product. It's a very basic assumption in classical economics. If price drops, you consume more. So this is there. Another assumption within classical economics is that of transitivity. So imagine if X is better than Y is better than Z, then it is logical to assume that X would be better than Z. So this is also there. And lastly, you have something known as expected value. Expected value is basically nothing but the sum of the probabilities that exist. So how we calculate expected value? So imagine if you toss a coin, you get $10 if you get a head, $0 if you get a tail. The expected value is uh, the value into the probability and the sum of that. So you get $5. Now let us see how you have some problems with classical economics and the assumption that classical economics makes. Now just look at this example. This is where irrationality comes in. I've shown you momos here. I love momos, so I've shown you the example of momos. Now imagine you buy a plate of momos at rupees 100 a plate. Okay, you buy momos every day. Now if tomorrow, and you like momos, now if tomorrow the person who sells you the momos drops the price to 75 rupees a plate, right? Now, classical economics will assume that as the price drops, you ought to consume more of this momo, this plate of momo, but that might not happen. Why? Because as the price drops, a fear might be there in your head that, hey, wait a minute, maybe the owner who's selling the momo has compromised on quality. He has compromised on the ingredients that have gone. He's compromised on the raw materials. So it could very well happen that he drops the price and you consume less of the momos. So this is where it goes in complete violation of classical economics, the law of demand itself. And this is something the classical economics is not able to explain many times. So this probably doesn't hold true. Then comes the question of transitivity. Now imagine if I give you a set of three options, right? Where would you want to go? Firstly, let's talk in pairs. I give you an option. Where do you want to go between France and Poland? And you say, I want to go to France. Okay, fine. I give you an option between Poland and Singapore. And you say, I want to go to Poland, between Poland and Singapore. Now, based on this, transitivity would say that you would prefer France over Singapore. However, a rational person might always say that I would want to go to Singapore to France. Now, the reasons could be many, and it's not, and there's nothing wrong with these people. They are very sound, lucid people, and even if you go and ask these people, they give you a very justified reason for picking Singapore over France, even though this goes in strict violation of transitivity as well. So these are just a couple of examples of how you see violations of assumptions within classical economics itself. And that is what gave birth to behavioral economics, which tried to talk about human behavior, because human behavior was not talked about much in classical economics. And this is the same reason why Kotler, who's like a very big guy in marketing, he said that classical economists never really studied how sellers and buyers make their decisions, but marketing always tried to explain the motivations of buyers, sellers, and their belief systems. So this is where the whole marketing is based on this. See, if we were all rational people, then a lot of marketing would actually fail. We would not buy things the way we buy had we been all rational people. So that is how this thing came about. Now, why is our decision making not always rational? One obviously is lack of information. We don't have a lot of information at times. The other is lack of time. We don't have a lot of time at times. And the other is biases. We don't realize it, but we're very, very biased. We come in with a lot of biases, which skew our, one could say, decision making many a times. So what are these biases? I'll just try to talk about a few of the biases that exist, which makes us irrational or not so rational. So we were talking about biases, right? So one of the most common biases that are out there is called an easy to recall bias. Now, what does it mean? Now, let us try to find that out using one example. Now, if I were to ask you, rank the following as far as cause of death is concerned worldwide in the year 2017. What do you think is the biggest cause of death? And just rank them. You got terrorism and conflict, nutritional deficiencies, HIV/AIDS, diarrheal diseases, cardiovascular diseases. Now, not all, but most people would be tempted to believe that the number one cause of death is terrorism and conflict, probably then nutritional diseases, HIV/AIDS, and diarrheal diseases probably come at the bottom. But the reality is completely the flip side of this, where the number one killer is cardiovascular diseases, then comes diarrheal diseases, HIV/AIDS, nutritional deficiencies, and the last is actually terrorism and conflict. Now, why does this happen? Why do we feel that terrorism and conflict should be right up there? Now, this is because of this easy to recall bias, where we feel that whatever things are easy for us to recall, probably because we hear about them in the news, we assume that its frequency is also high out there. So since it's easier for us to recall terrorism, we think that, oh, maybe that is the biggest cause of death worldwide, whereas that's not the case. Diarrheal disease, no one talks about it. It's very hard for us to recall as well, but it's a very big killer. And here's the data worldwide, and you can see cardiovascular disease is the number one killer. Diarrheal disease is pretty far behind, but here it is, 1.57 million. Whereas you look at conflict, it's way down there, 129,000. Now, I'm not saying that that number is a small number, but compared to diarrheal diseases with 1.57 million, there's a big difference. Let's look at a few other biases. Now, this one is called misconceptions of chance. Now, if I were to ask you that you have been given a series 1, 2, 3, identify the next three numbers in the series. Now, most people will answer 4, 5, 6. Now, I'm not saying that's the wrong answer, but that is just one of the answers, because I have not given you additional information. This could be a standard number series, in which case it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. However, this could be a completely random series as well. So after 1, 2, 3, you can have three very random numbers. It could even be a Fibonacci series. Fibonacci series would mean that the next number is a sum of the previous two numbers. So it would be 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. But I have not given you that information, but you assume it should be 4, 5, 6 because of an inherent bias that we have. Again, another bias that often does get manifested is that if a coin is tossed, we would assume that the probability of getting a tail, head, tail, head, tail, head, tail in a series of 7 coin tosses would be more likely than getting 7 tails in a row. Whereas the reality is that the probability of getting this combination in 7 throws or 7 tosses or getting this combination is exactly the same, because in every single toss the probability is just 50%. 50% you get a head, 50% you get a tail. So getting this combination is just as likely as getting this combination, and doesn't make a difference. But we assume that this is more likely than this, again, because of certain biases that we have. Look at the last two examples. Imagine if I have 3 daughters, I would assume that the likelihood of having a boy as the 4th child is higher. Again, not true. The probability remains the same. The probability of a boy remains 50%. The probability of girl becomes 50%, remains 50%. The last one is called a gambler's fallacy, which talks about the game of roulette. Roulette is a famous game that's played in casinos. Basically, you spin the wheel, and there are 2 colors, basically red and black, and you bet on which color is going to come. Now imagine a scenario where you get the color red 10 times in a row. Now most people will now assume that once you've got the color red 10 times in a row, you will now get the color black 10 times in a row to even the 10 times red, which is completely random. You cannot make that assumption. That assumption is wrong. You can't expect that just because you got 10 reds in a row, now you're going to get 10 blacks in a row to even the 10 reds. It won't even out. We assume that it'll even out because of some law of nature, but that's not how things work. The probability of getting, after 10 reds, the probability of getting a black still remains 50%. It does not suddenly change to something else. So, and the reason why we use it, a gambler's fallacy, is because after getting 10 reds in a row, people start betting against the red and start betting on the black, assuming that now definitely the black is going to come. But you never know. It might as well come. It might just come. Maybe in 1,000 turns or in 1,000,000 turns, in all likelihood, you will get 50% of the times you're going to get red, 50% of the time you're going to get black. But that is very likely because that is how probability works. But the gambler's fallacy talks about this very thing, that once you've gotten a series, that it's going to even out in the very next turn. Might not happen. Again, probability misconceptions of chance. The next one is called a sunk cost fallacy. It's a very, very common problem that we have, again, due to biases that we have, again, due to irrationality among people, where we are not able to identify sunk costs. Now, what do sunk costs mean? A sunk cost is basically a cost that has been incurred and cannot be recovered by any means. Take a look at the example. Imagine you buy an online course for 10,000 rupees, which spans over 3 months, requires you to spend 10 hours of your time every week. Right after the first class, you realize you made a big mistake and the course is not great. Unfortunately, you cannot even get a refund now since the course has started. So what do? Now, a rational person, realizing that the money is spent, it's a sunk cost, you cannot get the money back, would not attend the course and waste 10 hours of his time every week for the next 3 months. But most people actually grudgingly sit through the course, spending 10 hours of their precious time just because they want to make up for the cost, because they don't want to waste away the fees, which is probably the wrong way to look at it, because you're not able to identify what is a sunk cost. Sunk costs are costs that have been incurred and you will not recover it. You will not recover your course fees once you have spent it. If it's not worth it, don't do it. And I think this is a problem that even managers face in companies, where they are not able to identify which projects have gone bad and just cutting the cord. I know as a manager, you'd be handling different projects. Some projects you would have invested a lot of time, a lot of money, but if the project is going nowhere, there is no point in you spending more resources and time on that project. You might as well cut your losses and divert away all those resources into other projects. And that is what you need to do. And I think that is where the ability lies in a manager of identifying sunk costs. The next one is what we call prospect theory. Now, this is something that was propagated, propounded, popularized, I would say, by Kahneman and Tversky. They were 2 famous Israeli economists who later went to the US, and they came up with this fantastic curve which is forever now associated with prospect theory, where they said that if you have got gains, so what they did on a graph, they plotted the gains against value. So imagine if you gained $0.5, that would translate into a value of 20. Let that number not signify anything, but let it be an arbitrary number. It signifies a value of 20. Higher the number, the more the value, but 20 for gain of $0.5. But what is surprisingly even noticed was when you lose $0.5, instead of this value being minus 20, it was minus 40. So the losses hurt twice as much as the gains. So you ascribe a number which is twice as much in the negative for a loss as you would have done for a gain, which is a fantastic insight. Which clearly says that gaining 10 rupees is not the same as losing 10 rupees, because the pain of losing 10 rupees is twice as much as the happiness of gaining 10 rupees. And this is a very, very profound insight, which has a lot of applications. And what it also shows, if you look at the graph itself, is that when it comes to gains, humans are inherently risk averse, because gains don't mean that much to them, so they're risk averse in gains. Whereas since losses hurt them so much, they are risk seeking in losses to make up for the losses that they already have. So we'll take a look at an example just to prove that point. So take a look at this example. If we play a game, which option would you choose? A sure win of 1,000 rupees, or you toss a coin, you gain 2,000 if it's a head, or you get nothing if it's a tails. Now, the expected value of both these options is 1,000 rupees, so a rational person should be indifferent. But a normal person, owing to prospect theory, since this is a question of gain, would be risk averse, because gains don't mean that much as losses to him. So he would be risk averse. He will not be willing to take risk. So he would always, in this scenario, go with option 1. He would go for a sure win of 1,000. He will not go for option 2. And that is what's been observed. So that is why we say we are risk averse in gains. Take a look at losses. Take a look at this scenario. You have just lost 30 rupees because I told you so. Now you're asked to play the same game. Which option would you pick? Win 30 if the throw of a die yields 1 or 2, or gain nothing. A sure 10 rupees. Now in this case, since you have already lost 30 rupees, so you already have this pain of losing 30. So you're in your mental account, you're negative 30. Now you want to make up those losses now. And because you want to make up those losses, because losses hurt a lot, you're willing to take risk. And because you're willing to take risk, you go with option 1 here. You go with option 1 where you want to take the risk, even though you know 2/3 of the time you will end up with nothing, but you're still willing to take the risk, and you're willing to forego a sure 10 rupees. And that is the great insight out of prospect theory, where in losses you become risk seeking, in gains you become risk averse. Where you are risk averse, in this case you become risk seeking. Yeah, tell me.
I have a question here.
Yeah.
So in the first case, if we reverse the scenario,
yeah.
And what we mean by that is that the scenario is sure win of 1,000, or toss a coin, you can gain 2,000. If it's a head, get nothing.
Yeah.
Now the scenario reverses and sure win becomes a sure loss of rupees 1,000. And the second is you toss a coin, you lose rupees 2,000. It's a heads, and get and lose nothing if it's tails.
Yeah.
In this, so people would like people should choose the second option, right? In this case.
Yeah. Correct. Prospect. Yeah. Again, because so whenever we are whenever you are confused, see, just look at, are you gaining or losing? If it's gaining, if you're gaining, people will be risk averse. If it's a question of losses, people will always be risk seeking. So that is how you need to look at it. So is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
But if you look at the probability, expected value or expected loss, it's same in both the cases, right?
Correct, correct. See, a rational person would be indifferent between the two, but unfortunately we are not rational people. We have emotions, we feel things certain ways, and we'll always make decisions which cannot be explained by a standard rational theorem. And that is why a lot of economics which is based on expected value, we always go against it. We always violate expected value. So that is how it happens. Okay, so let me just, can I move forward?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So we see, I think this is something which is interesting. And because we have seen prospect theory, you can actually take values of X and Y and you can actually plot the graph as to how we would behave. Now imagine this is the case. Imagine you're gaining X and you're gaining Y. So should you integrate your gains or you should segregate your gains? And this you might find interesting. So what prospect theory also says, this is an extension of prospect theory, is if you have multiple gains, it's always better to segregate gains. So imagine between the two options, you are given lottery tickets and you win 5,000 in one lottery and you win 2,500 in another lottery. Second option is you win a lottery, you are given a lottery ticket and you win 7,500. In this case, if there are two separate gains, it's always better to segregate the gains. So you will always pick option 1 over option 2, because when gains are there, you always like gains to be segregated. And this was obviously a lot of marketing applications as well, when companies would try to segregate gains so that they are able to bring much more delight to the customer, because customer value, when you do a value analysis, you'll find that yeah.
Do you have one example for this situation, especially for marketing parts?
Marketing would be if, for example, just take this example. If when there are cases of later payoffs, if I give customers that, okay, you buy this is the payoff that you get now, and then you get payoffs at much later dates also, rather than giving one big payoff in the beginning. So that is what I would say would be an example of that. Let me give you try to give you concrete example here. Damn, I'm not able to come up with a concrete marketing example, but the way you have to craft is by giving payoffs later, by segregating the payoffs, you are able to give more delight to the customer rather than having one big payout or one big payoff, where obviously 7,500 feels very good, but if it's 5,000 plus 2,500, which is separated, the value people ascribe to it is much more. So that is why it says value of X plus Y is less than value of X plus value of Y. Okay.
So if we look at the e-commerce giants and the kind of offers they give, one major kind of offer is where you get a cashback now, or you get a 10% discount, and then you get 5% cashback. So does it follow the same theory?
No, yes. So I'll tell you about that. That comes later. So in that case, what's happening is you are paying money from your pocket, right? So that is actually something that is actually a loss, because you're giving some. But I will cover that. I'll cover that for sure. Don't worry about it. That is coming later.
I'm talking about an offer like you are buying a mobile phone, and you get a 10% off, and then you get also a 5% cashback in your Amazon Pay balance, right? So
okay, then what you can do, but see, in that case, what's happening is that is a case of mixed losses. So what I mean by mixed losses is you have made a payment from your pocket, so that's a loss, right? Now you are getting, okay, let me cover that so you'll understand what I mean by that. Let me cover that. That example is coming next. Okay. So so whenever gains are there, you segregate gains. Next is What if you have multiple losses? So you're losing once and you're losing again. In those cases, it's always better to integrate losses. So if you have a stock X, its price falls, you lose 10,000 in a single day. Now you have a stock X, its price falls, you lose 7,000 one day. You have another stock Y, which also loses 2,500 the same day. Now in this case, again, it's been through research we found out people always try to integrate their losses. So you'd always prefer option one here, where you're like, I'd rather have one stock which loses 10,000 rather than having two separate losses, because two separate losses hurt a lot more. And when you do always integrate losses, it's always better to integrate losses when you are facing with two separate losses. You lose once, you lose again. It's better to integrate them rather than losing two separate times. Okay.
Sorry to cut you out again.
Yeah.
But just an analogy to it. I was doing a small project on Myntra once, and one of the major findings was that there was a high percentage of people who were leaving on the payment page.
Yeah.
Right? So the moment they were making the payment, they were leaving it and they were closing and they were leaving the website. There was a drop there. So one interesting find was that was not happening in case of Flipkart, which is owned by the. So even for the products of the same price, that was not happening in Flipkart, but was happening in Myntra. And what was realized was that Myntra charges VAT and taxes at the end, at the payment page.
At the payment page, okay. Yeah.
Person is adding to the cart, he sees 1,000, but when he goes and makes payment, he sees 1,200. Whereas the same person, if he does the same thing on Flipkart, he sees 1,200 at the start only, because that's included. So I think
so this happens a lot of times. So I think what you're saying is absolutely correct. So many times what happens is, even when you're buying, say, something of Swiggy or something, you always like the guys to put up the price up front, which includes delivery also, which includes VAT also, which includes all the taxes also. So when you're at the payment gateway, you know you're not being charged additional. But the moment you see you being charged, then it hurts you. And that's exactly what I've even seen. And this is something which has happened earlier also. People who sell online courses. Okay, so they will charge their course at, say, whatever. So imagine you value your course at for $499, right? Now you have priced your product at $499, but once you go to the payment gateway, they have those transaction costs, and they ask you to pay 18% VAT also. Now you see a lot of people leaving the basket at that point and not going through the payment. I think the best thing obviously is when you put that price of $499, say that this includes the VAT also, and that is how you ought to price products. When you price your product, include the VAT, and that's how you should do the calculation. Then, because it goes back to prospect theory and how people think. Okay, so next one, I'll move forward to the next example. What if we have a mixed gain? Mixed gain in the sense you have a gain and you have a loss, but the gain is more than the loss. So what should we do? Should we integrate in those cases, or should we segregate in those cases? Now, in those cases, when you have mixed gain, the idea is always to integrate. So imagine you won a quiz. You received 35,000 prize money. However, the government asks you to pay 10,000 as taxes on your winnings the same day. Compare that to the second option. You won a quiz and you received 25,000 as prize money, tax-free. Now, in this case, people will always try to integrate their gain, and they'll always go with option 2. Because imagine if I give you a big chunk of money, then you don't want to give a part of that money back to me, right? So the first option always hurts. You win 35,000, you feel very happy, and suddenly government asks you to pay 10,000 out of your own pocket. It hurts you a lot. Compare that to winning a quiz where you receive 25,000. The prize money is less, but it's tax-free. You're not giving anything out. So you'd always go with option 2. You want to integrate in case of mixed gain, right? Coming to the next option, what if you have a mixed loss? So This is the example that you were talking about, the cashback thing, and a lot of people do it. So, and this is what, and the cashback or the rebate is usually known as a silver lining effect. So let me tell you how it happens. So imagine you damage your laptop, you spend 10,000 repairing the same. Later the same day, you get a call from the service repair team giving you a 500 rupee cashback. Second option, you damage your laptop and you spend 9,500 repairing the same. Now, in this case, it's been found out. In the first option, even though you're paying more, you're paying 10,000, the moment you get a cashback, you suddenly feel very, very happy. And that is known as a silver lining effect. The silver lining of even a small minuscule cashback makes kind of tapers over the loss of 10,000. That kind of makes you not feel so bad about losing 10,000 or paying 10,000. So 500 cashback acts as a silver lining and it makes you feel better compared to 9,500 no cashback, no nothing. Again, expected value in both cases is exactly the same, but people prefer one. Whenever there's a mixed loss where you're paying more and the gain that you're getting is less, people like to segregate that. It's always better to segregate. Again, if you're a marketer, that is why rebates work, cashbacks work, because people always try to segregate mixed losses rather than integrating them. If you want to integrate, always integrate mixed gains. So that is how the logic works here. And this all comes from prospect theory. Shall I go ahead?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So the next one is framing. Now, again, this is also an extension of how we feel. Now, framing effect is basically the difference in consumer behavior based on something, if it's framed as a gain or as a loss. So you could have, you don't miss out on. Now, as you can see, if I frame something as a gain, you will inherently become risk averse. The moment I frame something as a loss, you immediately become risk seeking. And this is what marketers do. They use framing to either make you risk averse or risk seeking. So let me give you one very common example of framing so you can understand. It's not a marketing example, but it kind of gives you an idea how framing works. Now imagine this. Again, in both cases, expected value will come always the same, just that framing plays a role in us picking one over the other. Imagine you're a large car manufacturer. A large car manufacturer has been hit by coronavirus and is facing economic difficulties. It might have to shut down 3 factories and lay off 6,000 employees. The VP operations has been exploring alternative ways to avoid this crisis and develop 2 plans. Plan A. This plan will save 1 of 3 factories and 2,000 jobs. Plan B. This plan has a 1/3 probability of saving all 3 factories and all 6,000 jobs, but a 2/3 probability of saving no factories and no jobs. Which one would you select? Now, as you would see, I have framed this as a gain. This plan will save 1 out of 3 factories and 2,000 jobs. Now, since I've framed this as a gain, you'll always be risk averse. So you'll always pick plan A over plan B because plan B has been framed in such a way, it's framed as a gain only, but it involves risk. So you'll always go with plan A in this case. Look at the second scenario, exactly the same thing, but it's been framed as a loss. Now you see, a large car manufacturer has been hit by coronavirus, facing shutdown. You can save 3 factories, save 6,000 employees. What do? Plan A. This plan will result in a loss of 2 out of 3 factories and 4,000 jobs. Plan B. This plan has a 2/3 probability in resulting in loss of all 3 factories and all 6,000 jobs, but a 1/3 probability of losing no factories and no jobs. Now, the moment I frame this as a loss, that you will lose all factories, you lose all employees, suddenly you become more risk taking. So people in this case will always go with plan B. Because even though there's a probability that you lose everything, 2/3 probability, but since I see that there's a 1/3 probability of gaining everything back, of losing no people, no jobs, suddenly we become risk seeking. Whereas there is no difference between this, the first option is the first scenario, the second scenario has been, it's exactly the same scenario, just as the framing in the first one is the gain framing, the second one is the loss framing. And it changes the way we think. We become risk-seeking to risk-averse. And again, the way you change your communication is a big way of how people behave and the kind of decision-making people take. So that is how framing works.
Before we move to decoy effect, and by the time you're putting the screen, I have a quick question here.
Yeah.
To remind of the entire behavioral economics is that even though classical economics assumes we are rational, we are not, and we make those decisions, and hence behavioral economics come into play, and hence it's used widely by market. Now, does that apply also to B2B sector? Because in B2B we're supposed to make rational decisions, and I hope that we do. And in that, how we can behavioral economics has.
Oh, no. So behavioral economics even would apply even in B2B cases. Now, let me try to think of an example in a B2B scenario. So a lot of managerial decisions that we do we see, they are based on, you're talking about marketing perspective, right? Yeah. So even in marketing perspective, let me try and see whether I can cover some of them in, one second. Let me see if I'm covering those examples in the next slide, 1 second. Okay. No, see, you can use, there's nothing stopping you from using behavioral economics in a B2B scenario. You can use framing, you can use even decoys. Let me show you one example of a decoy, and then probably it will become clear that you can even use it in a B2B scenario when it comes to pricing your product. So pricing is one place where this does have application in B2B space also, and decoy is also something that you can use in a pricing scenario in a B2B space. Now, so let me just try to explain that example once, and maybe you can see. Imagine if you're trying to sell a product to a business. If you use a decoy, you can, if you want, nudge the consumers to buy a certain product that you want them to buy. So we'll look at that. So for example, let me just finish off decoy effect first. So imagine what happens in decoy effect is that if you're trying to sell two products, one product is priced higher than the other, and you want to increase the sales of the higher priced product, then you employ decoys. A decoy is a third product that's introduced along with those two options to suddenly make the higher priced option look a better deal. So how does it work? Now imagine you're trying to sell popcorn. Okay, you go to a movie theater, you run a theater, you're watching a movie and you want to buy popcorn, and you're selling popcorn there. There's a small size popcorn for $1.99. There's a large size popcorn for $3.99. Now, normal person would go and he will be like, okay, I don't know which one I want. So some people will buy the small size popcorn, the other ones will buy the large size popcorn. Now, you who's selling the popcorn obviously wants to increase the sales of the large size popcorn, because obviously the price is higher, the profits are higher, so you want to boost the sales of the large size popcorn. So what do? You introduce a decoy. Now, how does the decoy work? You introduce a third product to make this one, the higher priced one, look a very good deal. So how do you do that? You introduce a medium sized popcorn at $3.89. So in your head, if earlier you were buying the small size popcorn for $1.99, in your head you are thinking, okay, for $3.89, I'm getting a medium sized popcorn, but by paying just 10 rupees extra, I'm getting a large size popcorn. So the large size popcorn is a very good deal. So you have tricked the consumer into believing that the large size popcorn is an amazing deal just by introducing the decoy. Now remember, you're not trying to boost the sales of the decoy, you're trying to boost the sales of the large size popcorn. And you would see inherently a lot of people who initially would have bought the small size popcorn switch over and buy the large size popcorn just because they think it's a good deal, by simply introducing this decoy in the middle, which is a medium sized popcorn at $3.89. you might not sell even a single medium-sized popcorn, but that is immaterial because you are now selling more of the large-sized popcorn. And this is how decoys work. Now, you can use decoys in a B2B space as well if you are trying to sell two different products to them at two different price points, but obviously you want to upsell and you want the consumers to buy the higher priced product, introduce a decoy, and you can nudge the consumer to buy the higher priced product. So that's how it works. Now we'll see further examples of this. Now, this is an example that was carried out in The Economist. Economist was a very big news agency. So what they did, they went out and asked 100 students, what would you want? Do you want The Economist, the online subscription of The Economist, which was for $59, or you want the print subscription for $125? Naturally, people saw more value with the online version. So 68% people went with that, 32 went with the print version. And you can do a small calculation here and even calculate how much revenue they would have earned. Now, The Economist, after this experiment, did a very nice decoy. They introduced a third option. So what did they do? They said that you can still have your online subscription of 59, you can still have your print subscription 125, but now you can have the print Yeah, can you can continue? Okay. So,
Yeah, it would
so
be
what?
great if you can start with the Economist example from start.
Okay, 1 second. So this is an example. This is a so you guys can hear me now again?
We can. We can.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
Hear you. We can
Oh.
hear you, Aditya.
Oh, okay, great. So this is the Economist example. So what happened in this example was the Economist went out. So this is another example of decoy effect. So the Economist went out and they asked 100 MIT students, which one would you pick? The one is the online subscription of the Economist for $59 per annum. And the other one was a print subscription, which is the hard copy for $125 per annum. Right? So these were the two options given. So now, yeah.
Would you mind resharing your screen? Because I'm not able to.
Okay,
see.
1 second. Sorry. Okay. Let me know when you can see my screen.
Yeah, I can see.
You can see the screen?
Right.
You can see it? Yeah?
Yes.
Shall I continue? Okay, great. So they went out, they asked 100 people, and naturally people who saw more value in the online subscription alone, they went with that, and people who saw more value with the print subscription, they went with that. So you see the split here. 68% went with the online subscription, 32 went with the print subscription, and you can even do a small calculation here as to how much revenue the economists would have earned from this. 68 into 59 plus 32 into 125, $8,000. Now the economist here did a very clever decoy to convince people to buy the 125 version, but how did they do it? So what they did was they introduced a decoy. They said that you still can have the online subscription for $59, the print subscription for $125, but now they introduced a decoy. They said you can have the print and online together for $125. It was all the people who initially had picked the print subscription, they all migrated here because obviously print plus online is better than print. And even the people who had actually initially gone with just the online subscription, they also saw a great value in having print plus online now. So even those people who initially were spending only $59, they migrated here and they are now paying $125 because it is print plus online. And remember, this is also a win-win for the economist as well, because the marginal cost for them to onboard another person on the online subscription is hardly anything. So it was a win-win for the economist as well. And even if you do a calculation now at the side, you can even see how much revenue the economist would have earned. 16 into 59 plus 84 into 125, $11,000. Purely on account of the introduction of this new decoy. So the increase in revenue is almost $3,432 purely because they introduced another decoy here. So a decoy was able to nudge people from buying a lower priced product to a higher priced product and inherently increase the revenues for the economy. So this is another example of a decoy. I'll show you one last example of a decoy, and this is to do with this is actually a screenshot that I've taken from the print. The print is a pretty famous news agency in India, and they don't actually charge you money. It's a free thing, but they do insist that can people make a one-time voluntary donation or something. Okay, so this is their donations page. So you go there and they give you an option, make a one-time payment, right? Now they give 4 options: $25, $100, $250, $500, and $100 comes pre-selected. Now here again, one can see this is not exactly decoy, but it's another variant of decoy, and it's kind of something again which is used to nudge people. Here you can clearly see the $500 is actually a decoy. It is actually there to nudge people to pay $100, because even people at the print would know that no one would pay $500, right? Because $500 is a big substantial donation. So they've put the 500 there, so the 100 does not seem like a huge money name, right? It normalizes $100 payment, as opposed to, imagine if I had kept here $25, $75, $100, then people might have paid $25, people might have paid $75, but very few would have paid $100. But now that you have put this acts as a decoy which nudges people into paying $100. So this also is a form of decoy, not exactly a decoy, but another form of decoy, where the higher value acts as a decoy so that you pay at least $100. So the people who add the print, they were very clear in their head that we want people to pay $100. So then you put decoys to nudge people into paying what you want them to pay. So this is a variant. Okay. So this is another form of kind of a variation of decoys nudging, which this is actually called center stage. What this actually says is, humans have a tendency to go and pick the product which is placed in the middle. So what does it mean? So I was actually, this is from the website called Hostinger. I was there trying to buy a hosting service from them, and these were the 3 plans that they had. So what happened was, now if you can see the 3 plans, they have actually designed their website and their offerings in such a way that we inherently pick the plan which is in the middle, and that is called center stage. We pick the plan in the middle, and they have actually crafted this in a very beautiful way, and you can see it here. The plan in the middle, it clearly says this is the most popular. Here, even if you see the benefits that you see here, this 59, this 119, this 219. If you see the coloring that's been used, here you get 1 website, you get 100 websites, one email, 100 email, 100,000 monthly visitors, unlimited visitors. And you see the color coding here, yellow, 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 green, red. Here's all green. So this again creates this perception, array, this must be so much more better than this. Even though your requirement might just be this, but since crafted this in such a clear way, you are nudged to believe that this is so much more better than this, even though your requirement might just be this. And when you compare this with this, the same color coding. So what they're also telling you is there is not much difference between these two, the business web hosting and the premium web hosting, because they've kept the color coding same. So you are nudged into believing that the one in the middle is better than the rest, and so I should go with the two. So I should go with the one in the middle, and the company also wants you to buy the middle. So the company is very clear in their head that this is the product that we want to push. So they craft center stage in such a way that people are nudged into buying the one in the middle. And also they say save 70%. So save 55, save 70, save 70. So the savings are also shown most. Now it hardly takes me anything. I can change this price to anything and show maximum savings here. Again, just to nudge people into buying this. So this is how center stage works. Another example of center stage. Center stage is very, very common. A lot of people do it. Again, this is a screenshot that's taken from G Suite. So G Suite also does it. They got the business starter plan, business standard, business plus. Again, they have crafted business standard in such a way that people are nudged into buying the business standard. So this is how center stage works. If you got multiple offerings, and among those multiple offerings, if there's one offering that you want to push, you craft it in such a way. And this is where behavioral economics comes into picture. The next one, yeah.
A couple of observations. If you have recently seen donations by Wikipedia, instead of saying that this is the most popular one or pre-selecting, they had I said 50 rupees for Indians. It was in INR. I think 100 or 200 amount where they had written below it that this is what most people have donated.
Okay, yeah. So that is another form of nudging people. Yeah. So that again, that's also true. That is another way of nudging people, that most people have picked this. So you are inherently forced to believe that, okay, this is what I should be doing. So you are basically nudging people to go a certain direction. So yeah, I would completely agree with you there. So that also is very, very common. So next one is called utility. Now, utility is the value that you get by making a purchase, right? And people have found out through studies that utility is actually a product of acquisition utility and transaction utility. And now what does it mean? Acquisition utility basically means what is the quality of the deal. So if you're getting a lot of things at a very good price, then that would increase your acquisition utility. The transaction utility is the quality of the deal itself. So if you're getting something at a huge discount, that increases your transaction utility. So let me just explain to you how it works by giving you some examples. So this is a screenshot that I took last night of an Apple Mac. If you go to Flipkart, so you can see you got all these features there: 5th gen, 8 GB, this, that, and obviously there are a lot of features which are not captured in the screenshot, but a lot of features which are given, all the great things, great reviews and all that. And then you got the price, 64,990. So if you feel that, wow, I'm getting all these features at a great price, that increases your acquisition utility. What they've also done is they have shown you this little thing here. So the price was initially 85,000. It has now come down to 64,000. So you're getting a 23% off. So the nature of the deal itself, the discount, the more the discount, the more is your transactional utility. So transactional utility deals with the deal itself. If you're getting something at a very big discount, and the acquisition utility deals with the quality of the deal. If you're getting a lot of features at a great price. So if you increase the discount, it increases your transactional utility, thus increases your total utility, and thus you're nudged into buying a product. Now, you see lots of examples of these. Now, take a look at this. Now, this is someone, he's a very famous guy. He's there on LinkedIn, and he advertises his LinkedIn workshop a lot. Now, you see how he has done it. He says you can build a strong personal brand, get inbound leads, amazing job opportunities, everything. So he's talking a lot about the great features of his product, and he's saying, guess what? You can get the product for $499. So that increases your acquisition utility. But then to enhance the transaction utility, what he's saying is, guess what? All these things are worth $2,000, 2,000 rupees, but I'm giving it to $499. So suddenly when you see this massive discount, it increases your transaction utility. So you should always look at utility in two ways. You should always look at utility as transaction utility and acquisition utility, and you should try to enhance both to sell your products. And these people have successfully done both. They are able to enhance acquisition utility as well and transaction utility as well. In my case, the most extreme example of this is something like a Udemy. If you've seen Udemy, Udemy will show you all the great benefits at 700 rupees. You're like, wow, that's amazing. You know, I'm getting all these great courses, everything for just 700 rupees. So that increases the acquisition utility. But the moment you see that this course was originally priced at 8640 and you're getting it at 92% discount, that immediately enhances your transaction utility. You're like, wow, I'm getting an amazing deal. So that is how you should look at pricing a product. So if you are selling a product, do not be afraid to price your product higher and then say that this product is being offered to you at a massive discount because it enhances the transaction utility of people. This is how we are wired. If you give more transaction utility, people will see more total utility, and thus people will be nudged into buying a product. So that is how utility works. So finally, this is the last slide here. Finally is ethics. So we have talked a lot about nudging, decoys, center stage and all that. So the question that arises in a lot of cases, is this ethical? Is what we are doing, is it actually ethical? And the final answer is that all is fair till there is consumer free will. As long as you're not impinging on consumer free will, everything is fair. So even if you're doing a decoy, there's nothing that is coercing the consumer into buying the higher priced product. You have given the consumer the free will. So as far as ethics is concerned, there's something that always comes up, but I would say all is fair till the time there is consumer free will. So that is that. This was the last slide. Thank you so much. Obviously, there are a lot of topics within behavioral economics that we have not covered because they were so extensive. I wanted to keep it short, but again, this session was also stretched a lot. But thank you all for joining. If you have any questions, I would be happy to take them, or else we can conclude. So there are no questions? Okay, great. So thanks a lot. Thank you for joining. So yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you for joining. Yay. Yeah.